Hello and welcome to this next talk. It was almost exactly 1 year ago we had the pleasure to hear Angela Harutyunyan presentation on the uneasy contemporary of Soviet modernity in the context of the Symposium Crisis as Form. Today we welcome you back. Welcome back, Angela. Today she will give us a talk with the title Wet Dreams for America, Sex, Desire and Technology in Post-Soviet Armenia. She's a professor of art history at the Berlin University of the Arts. In 2010, she was visiting professor and art program director at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. In 2011 and to 2023, before joining UDK, she taught at the American University of Beirut, Lebanon, where she also had led the art history program. She's one of the founding editors of Art Margins, published by MIT Press. She has edited several volumes, published books, chapters, and contributed articles on post-Soviet art and culture, Marxist aesthetics, historical temporality, and cultural theory. Sorry about the rehearsal of the Markthalle. It's the concert venue next door that is causing some disruption here. Her monograph, The Political Aesthetics of the Armenian Avant-Garde, The Journey of the Painterly Real, was published by Manchester University Press in 2017. She is a curator of several exhibitions, including This is the Time, This is the Record of the Time at SMBA in Amsterdam and the AUB Art Galleries in Beirut. She is a founding member of two institutions, the Ashot Johannesian, I hope I say this right, Research Institute and the Humanities in Yerevan, and the Beirut Institute of Critical Analysis and Research in Lebanon. She has been appointed to curate the 17th Sharia Biennale in 2027. Her talk today situates the exhibition Sex Tapes, Desire of Technology and Technology of Desire within the turbulent and tempestuous decade of late Soviet and post-Soviet transformations in Armenia. It is an attempt to historicize the advent of video art within a paradigmatic shift of a modernist belief in reality as a field of transformative political and social action to media representations as more real than reality itself. Angela, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you, Martin, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Milan, and Sarah, Christian, the whole Consumerism team. I'm happy to be back here. So if records of history are able to shape a textured image of the past, the so-called post-Soviet transition in the 90s Armenia has the texture and materiality of the analog VHS with its characteristic graininess, color bleed, and noise. The mobile and transportable VHS tape was the opposite of the erratic and mystified medium of public TV, the official channel of broadcasting the truth. VHS brought home recorded images in ways that could be easily manipulated by the receiver, replayed, rewinded, fast-forwarded. It was the perfect medium for a new private individual splintered from the decaying corpse of the one-time collective. The official public television in the early post-Soviet years inherited the late Soviet perception that whatever was emanating from the cathode ray tube when one turned on to channel 1 and 2 could not be trusted. Oh, sorry, I have to, I guess, okay, I have to do some DJing. Okay, now I can switch. Let's go.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи.
Сегодня в 6 часов московского времени в Советском Союзе осуществлен старт универсальной ракетно-космической транспортной системы «Энергия».
Okay, just to give you a test of it. Broadcast television was seen as an apparatus of disseminating ideologically charged content, officially sanctioned lies. As opposed to the conception of the television as an apparatus of alienation, the VHS tapes seem to be personable and possessable, while providing supposedly direct and unmediated access to reality, to the coedition, and above all to censored content. If public TV addressed a mass audience, a social body that had been constituted as collectivity, even if the very ideology that had kept this body together was decomposing, VHS could be used and manipulated by individuals and disseminated at will. As a possessable commodity, the VHS tape was the perfect medium for the newly emerging consumer, which in the post-Soviet 90s, in the context of inflation, deficit of essential consumer products, and unemployment, was more of a phantasmic figure than an actual economic agent. As opposed to the public TV that broadcasted ready-made and sanctioned images, in the 90s, the proliferating local commercial channels, as well as cable television, promised to be gateway to the larger world, while at the same time encouraging audience participation through talk shows, street interviews, etc. Everyone, including myself, and these are exclusive images of the TV show that I myself had in the 90s called Bravo Baby, could be on TV. The broadcast on new commercial TV stations and cable TV often laid bare the device, if we use the expression of early 20th century Russian formalists, when unwittingly the very material processes of fast forwarding and rewinding the tape, or the physical medium being damaged from constant recording and erasing, or suddenly the program stopping in the middle of the broadcast, demystified the medium, with the structural conditions of the functioning of the apparatus exposed to the viewer. In the midst of economic collapse, energy shortage, the screen was gateway to a world of material plentitude, cool lifestyle, and the glimpse to other people's personal lives in other continents. Terrible melodramas of love, betrayal, deception, dedication, and cunning, where the good always and ultimately wins. Actually, in my hometown in the 90s, we had only sometimes 2 hours of electricity a day, and I remember families couldn't decide to cook, to wash, or to watch their favorite soap operas. For me, actually, I really preferred the commercials because they would interrupt this very slow-paced soap operas with their lively, more fast-paced imagery. The material infrastructure of the VHS tape, and by extent cable television, as well as cinema theaters, screening previously censored sexually explicit content, soft erotica most of the time, was the newly emerging, or rather newly imposed, market economy under the banner of so-called shock therapy. This new project treated the Soviet teleologically planned economy as a schizophrenic aberration from the neoliberal course of man's naturally given identification with private property. Once cured through rapidly injected economic measures such as privatization of state or public property, liberalization of prices, and tighter fiscal measures, along with virtual freeze on public spending, the former Soviet economic sphere, now constituted by barely born but already fractured nation states, the former Soviet economic sphere, would rejoin the utopian world of liberal democracies. But too much shock and not enough therapy was already the verdict in 1994 that one of the key architects of this doctrine, Jeffrey Sachs, himself announced. Presenting Yegor Gaidar, the former prime minister of Russia, who instituted the therapeutic measures in his short 6 months in office between March and December 1992, as a brave knight who deserves a seat in the Boys Club of Chicago, Sachs blamed the remnants of Soviet bureaucracy for the complete failure to reconstitute from the ruins of the former worker state a properly functioning market regime. Just to give you a glimpse of this said protagonist. Can we switch to the, or I have to do it here? No, I have to do it here. Yes.
for me, as at least as a representative of a nation that was the empire builder, of course the destruction of the Union is some kind of a tragedy. But I had accepted it as a reality. Probably for British, the destruction of a great empire was a tragedy once, but now it is accepted as a reality. We have to accept the reality. Nobody had invented real mechanism how to privatize the communist economy in 1 month. That is the political and so.
This is from Trauma Zone, which is actually contains amazing footage gathered and assembled by Adam Curtis, but otherwise really a very problematic film in terms of its, captions and how it constructs the entire late Soviet and post-Soviet world as like one trauma zone. Again, shock therapy, trauma. But the biggest culprits, according to Sachs, in an article that he wrote in 1994, were the global neoliberal institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, as well as the capitalist democracies, for failing to deliver the therapeutic measures in the form of a new, this time, neoliberal Marshall Plan. Too much shock, not enough therapy. In Armenia, the conditions of the utter collapse of the Soviet economic infrastructure, the dismemberment of this infrastructure as raw material, sometimes actually factories, machinery were sold as raw material to the neighboring countries, the ultimate emancipation of workers from wages in the form of mass unemployment paralleled the consequences of the devastating earthquake and the war with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. As the material world of the Soviet historical experience was turning into wreckage, the newly emerging media sphere, comprised of cable TV broadcasts, films, and shows made available on VHS, and cinemas repurposed as sex kinos, delivered a semblance of wholeness. The material world is broken and disintegrating, but there is another one available as an image. Video presented a fabricated and spectacular world of consumer freedoms, bodies sculpted by lycra garments, or otherwise made available without, in ample sex scenes that 90s cinema delivered. Even Hollywood was actually delivering sex scenes back then, which is kind of traditionally known as more conservative than European cinema houses. I quote from an article by Anna-Marie Giraud of New York Times of 1995. There are bras that enhance cleavage. There are petticoats that flatten the tummy and hips. There are panties that make the buttocks curvier. There are waist cinchers that make take an inch or more off the waistline. There are products to deal with just every figure flow a woman might have or thinks she has. And this 1995 column that summarizes the 90s fashion also is received by post-Soviet citizens that receive this message via body-shaping shows, first ads that infiltrate even the rigid public television, as well as thick mail order catalogs imported from the US without the actual products or shops being available for acquisition or a phone line to ring. These catalogs would be circulating in every household in the 90s, but the products were not there. There was no, I don't know, what are the big companies, Serial or Target, or there wurde magazines that were also available in plenty. But let's backtrack for a moment. I claim that this dream world of consumer freedom, sexual liberation, and erotica that came together solely as an image mediated through the screen with market economy functioning as its material base had already been signaled by the perestroika artistic avant-gardes in the mid to the late 80s, before anyone could even envision the collapse of the USSR. What became an economic reality in the 90s was already dreamt artistically in the 80s, except that this dream, as all other dreams, when realized, turned into a nightmare. There are perestroika artistic avant-gardes, that is the artists and intelligentsia who formed either on the margins of the official cultural policy that demanded liberalization, or in opposition to the latter and underground, conceived of utopia purely on terms that were anti-Soviet, and one which could be realized artistically. The utopia existed in space rather than in time as the realized dream world of Western freedom and consumerism. Perestroika's cultural and intellectual avant-garde imagined the content of the new art in and through the freedoms and lifestyles denoting all that was non-Soviet. Often semi-official and unofficial artists in the Soviet Union sought the form of new art in the styles, methods, and techniques that the official Soviet criticism designated as bourgeois formalism. Abstract expressionism, pop art, minimalism, objet trouvé, performance, and other forms repressed by socialist realism. Art as a sphere of absolute freedom that was guaranteed by the artist's irretractable right to mix incongruent styles, signs, and symbols on the canvas, and by extension, in the exhibition space, was too eerie a reminder of postmodernism unfolding on the other side of the so-called curtain, Iron Curtain. History appearing as an endless archive from which images, references, styles, and signifiers could be pulled, mixed, and repurposed. Here, the material referent, the Soviet historical experience, supposedly disappeared, while in reality its negation became the very condition of possibility for the endless game of signifiers or interchangeable simulacra. One such example that utilized the non-Soviet as a syntax to denote the anti-Soviet is an art collective in Armenia, the third floor, that formed on the margins of the official Soviet Union in 1987. Its members utilized a diverse arsenal of anti-Soviet signifiers to imagine both the canvas and the exhibition as a sphere of absolute freedom, where from Led Zeppelin to the Cadillac and from Marlboro cigarettes to the underground heroes of heavy metal and punk bands functioned at the same level of signification. Negatively, the signs denoted anything that was non-Soviet, and positively, this pointed at a utopia that existed beyond the Soviet. The third floor organized festival-like events where everyone and anyone could be an artist, including break dancers as well as bards and poets. Iconoclastic, it's a reproduction of the break dancers painting by Armand Grigorian. Iconoclastic vandals would exorcise the ghosts of the failing system with an entire arsenal of techniques, representations, and styles derived from post-war neo-avant-gardes. For instance, in this action, a member of the group, art critic Nazaret Karoyan, he collected the garbage, he inventorized it, and some of the garbage was actually collected from the rooftop of the Museum of Modern Art in Yerevan, which was actually the first such museum that opened in the USSR in 1972. It kind of represented national modernism, national in content and modernism, modern in form. And he inventorized this garbage and read this inventory out loud in an official artists union meeting in 1987. So artists who participated in this cultural movement, they used really the language of American post-war and European post-war art, from Sahak Borosyan's mannequins to Ashot's performances that were kind of striving towards communication, to artist Sev's objects that he would actually collect all kinds of raw material from the yards of factories, and he would walk with this really big torch, and he had a very sinister figure walking with this torch and melt them into various objects. To pop artworks by Karine Matsakian, they all came to denote, I think they all carried with them the signifier of being anti-Soviet and non-Soviet, but also looking at the West as the ultimate kind of horizon of freedom. The practice of one of the main protagonists of this cultural movement, Armand Grigorian, constituted this countercultural sphere as a painterly utopia, where the material flatness of the modernist painting crossed over the didactic flatness of the propaganda poster and was delivered through the screen of phantasmagoria. In the late 80s and early 90s, Grigorian adapted the figure of a vandal, through which he would perform radical iconoclastic gestures. In 1994, he scraped his diploma work done a decade earlier in 1984 at the Academy of Fine Arts and titled it Armenians Can Paint Rembrandt. Layers of painterly tradition and academic fine arts instruction were removed with a knife, inch by inch, while his character Vandal, in the spirit of Dadaist negation, would issue a manifesto called Dem, or Against, as a gesture of what Grigorian, referring to Marcuse, called Great Refusal. But unlike Dadaist negation, Grigorian's iconoclasm was only about clearing space for new iconophilia, creating the conditions of possibility for a positive utopia, possible only on the surface of a painting. At the same time as he was issuing the Dem Manifesto, he was populating his canvases with characters whose cohabitation could only be imagined on the canvas as a heterotopic montage. Punks with wolves, Cilician knights as metalists, nudes gathering to parade in Burchamud, an Armenian neighborhood in Beirut, or Yerevan, homosexuals in Gyumri, a rather conservative town in the north of Armenia, punks in the countryside, nudes and punks in the countryside, a refugee boy on a dolphin, along with ancient gods and goddesses, and most recently, before his untimely death earlier this year, the rebellious youth of Hazarajat, a mountainous region in Afghanistan where he saw freedom-loving youth fighting for its dignified existence. This painterly heterotopia that summoned references ranging from ancient Greece to contemporary Hazarajat was a utopian dream of universal love and sexual liberation, unfolding as the last spark of Enlightenment modernism, and was constituted as an idealized image of what Arman himself called Armenican freedom, Armenican painting, pop art adapted to as national fine arts in a way. What had been scraped through iconoclastic gestures as a negation of a painterly tradition seen as weighing heavy like a nightmare on the brains of the late Soviet and anti-Soviet youth, created a tabula rasa to be populated with new iconophilia, this time signifying the other to the Soviet painterly tradition and the social world from which it stemmed. Grigorian's various canvases from the mid-80s to his untimely death, Amerika, with a K, as a composite of the Western world from antiquity to the present, could be constituted and reconstituted as an image on the canvas as more real than reality itself. And unlike the Soviet-Russian band Nautilus Pompilus that in 1987 waved goodbye to America, the mirage dreamt by the Soviet anti-Soviet subject Grigorian never parted with this dream. And maybe just like a few minutes of this Nautilus Pompilus, because I think it's kind of funny and kitschy at the same time. It's a very sad song about saying goodbye to America that they never seen.
Когда умолкнут все песни, которых я не знаю, в терпком воздухе крикнет дай мне на прощанье,
It's like kind of the late Soviet Bon Jovi, but with very kitschy mix of very different styles. Yes. So basically what I claim, I mean, why do I talk about Armand Grigorian and his paintings while, I've been invited to speak about technology in the 90s. I think that it is this kind of structural displacement of the world of material contradictions with image constituting a reality more real than reality itself that was presaged by the perestroika artistic avant-gardes in the late 80s. And one that became a dominant condition throughout the 90s as the Soviet world was rapidly disintegrating. Here, the utopian image of America as a world of plentitude, anarchic freedom, love and sex was now screened through VHS tapes and cable TV. While in the late Soviet period, the 80s, VHS was a rare and hard-to-obtain commodity circulating underground beneath the watchful eyes of the official cultural sphere. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became easily available and accessible. Nevertheless, its status as a medium of delivering prohibited content and its promise of revealing truth in its nakedness, often literally, prevailed. Video was received predominantly as a medium for sexually explicit content, as well as for delivering the late capitalist dream world of commodities. If erotic and pornographic films were disseminated in the youth and underground artistic and literally subcultures on VHS tapes in the 80s, in the 90s, pornography became an inextricable part of media broadcast and found a prominent place in cinemas at all times of the day. I remember actually encountering these situations as a young teenager when we're watching TV as a family, and then there is a sex scene, and there's this kind of awkward moment where children are blushing, and once my grandfather turned to my grandmother and with genuine curiosity asked Anjik, what are they doing? And my grandmother's they're just massaging each other. And so there was kind of no conception of this for my grandfather that sex could take place in front of a camera. There was no visualization of it. And actually, about 15 years ago, when I was doing research in the Ministry of Culture's archive, then I found out that it was as late as in 1996 that TV channels, public or commercial, as well as cinemas, were no longer allowed to display pornography or erotica before 8 p.m. So before that, there's ample of pornographic content. So as I kind of claim in the curatorial text that is in the booklet, if famously there was no sex in the Soviet Union, in the post-Soviet condition, there was no sex unless screened through VHS. So video became an apparatus that brought together the commodity fetish and the sexual fetish, a technology of desire manufacturing a desire of technology. So it is this coupling of the belief in art as a sphere of dreaming about freedom with the conception of video as an apparatus for delivering sexually explicit content as a signifier of this freedom, and the potentially subversive character of this coupling that can be identified as the cultural condition of possibility of video art in Armenia in the late 90s and early 2000s. Actually, this talk should probably finish where the exhibition begins, but nevertheless, I'll go ahead a little further to situate the works that you can see in the other room. The late Soviet avant-garde's heterotopic juxtaposition of incongruous signs, symbols, and signifiers denoting the non-Soviet or anti-Soviet presaged the media construction of that very same utopia. If in the 80s this image was composed by a cultural fringe, late Soviet artists of the perestroika avant-garde, in the early to mid-90s, it acquired the status of a collective dream, a dream world dreamt by impoverished post-Soviet subjects. But as the 90s rolled forward towards the end of the millennium, it became clear that the neoliberal train was not an express transport to paradise. The mediascape now served the rising oligarchic elites, with a neoliberal remaking of urban landscapes according to their own image, combined with the resurgence of these oligarchic elites, combined with the resurgence of conservative religious nationalism. In Armenia ended the aspirations for a democratic future within the confines of peripheral uneven capitalist development, as the dream world of the late Soviet artists became the cultural reality. Freedom came to be seen as freedom to choose one's lifestyle. And there was actually one pivotal moment that that kind of served as a breaking point, right? And had a large impact upon the artistic community. And that was a massacre that took place in the Armenian parliament in 1999 on October 27, when several gunmen entered the parliament, took the entire National Assembly hostage for more than 24 hours, and ultimately they gunned down the Prime Minister, the Speaker of the Parliament, along with 8 other ministers and MPs. And this entire spectacle was broadcast live on TV because the Parliament session was ongoing. And in one article I claimed that back then people were like gathering around this scene. They actually went home to watch the spectacle unfolding on TV, because this is what they thought, this is the place where it is really happening, on TV, rather than around the physical, parameter of the National Assembly. So in the context of the disillusionment from earlier hopes for democracy and citizen participation that contemporary artists in Armenia had aspired to, many of them took up a video camera. Video crystallized the promise of delivering the truth as a kind of apparatus for self-confession and exposition. At the same time, it was the perfect medium for a radically alienated artist in the post-socialist conditions of economic precarity, political disenchantment, and cultural marginality. Video provided a means for private enclosure where the needs of the body could be voiced, supposedly without mediation. And this is the paradox of video art in Armenia in the late 90s and early 2000s. This extremely mediated medium was appropriated as one which supposedly completely lacked mediation. The screen was a gateway to the real, sex, murder, incest. And many artists were performing kind of a radical practices of exposing the body as a site of like violence, antagonism, political disillusionment, but also at the same time around the Armenian Center for Contemporary Art that had a very pivotal role in shaping the artistic context in the late 90s and early 2000s. There were also kind of post-punk and avant-garde groups that were forming, and you have one video that is displayed on one of the screens, which is a video clip from lesbian band Incest. Maybe I can briefly show another clip. So the body, in a way, right, became a site for breaking taboos. At least. minute. By the end of the 90s, contemporary art in Armenia came to be seen identical with video art, especially after the diaspora-funded Armenian Center for Contemporary Experimental Art imported video cameras and DVD players and made them available for the artists to use. This culminated in 2001 when ACCA took 16 video works by 16 artists to the Armenian Pavilion, the 49th Venice Biennale. And if the third floor of the late Soviet and early independence period defined its aesthetics in forms of style as a signifier of cultural resistance against Soviet cultural politics and ideology, in the late 90s, resistant and defiant artistic practice came to be largely defined through the artistic medium, video. Consequently, access to the increasingly globalized art world was at times perceived as granted solely to those artists who produced video art. And it is no wonder that what we have in video art is predominantly portraits. I'm yet to recall any video installation in Armenia that doesn't abide to this genre of a video portrait and deploys, more like a narrative structure. And maybe just before I end, a few words about the display here, because I treated the works from this period, the late 90s, 2000s, not as, let's say, like autonomous video works, because they were mostly part of installations. They were not only videos, right? They were part of video installations, but I treated them as documentation. And kind of took the liberty of, screening them as projections, again, rather than in monitors that were somehow how they were mostly displayed. You can see some examples of these videos found in installation contexts, such as in David Karian's work, Dead Democracy, where you have a sheep wool surrounded by these garments that are made of earth, and then in the video monitor, artist is, of course, rubbing ketchup that signifies blood to his body, to his face. Or in Diana Hakopian's work, you see another one here, Leave Me Alone, where the artist is actually actively punching this glass that carries cultural stereotypes as an act of kind of refusal to participate in kind of structures of subjectivization that are in place. Or another work by Diana Hakopian, where that's Karayan, her husband, herself, and their daughter. They are sitting in a setting of an apartment as if it's a kind of a quasi-natural, right, state of nature, but in reality, there are already roles that are assigned and that are played out as the kid is assembling this Lego toy. And Harutyunyan, you see the documentation of his performance where he's rubbing this Vaseline or lubricant upon his body and failing, and as he's failing or falling, you have this kind of almost like a three-dimensional, abstract expressionist painting, right, emerging through this almost like ejaculatory acts here. In another work of 2001, Harut is sewing a garment on one channel of the installation, while the second one, he's trying to put on a really downsized ballerina dress. And finally, Tigran Khachatryan's work, and you have actually the second time his work, Romeo, that is screened here. It's the second screening. After its premiere in 2003, it hadn't been shown between 2003 and the Kunstverein iteration. Khachatryan adopted this artistic method of mixing found footage with examples of cult films, from Pasolini's Teorema to Theodicy to Stalker's to Tarkovsky's Stalker and Peleshian's Us, to insert basically this what I call kind of frustrated subject of male desire into these films. And the Romeo that you see in that room clearly has like a structure of the male orgasm, right? As it kind of picks in and then culminates ultimately under this like Wagnerian tunes of the gas stove that turns off. In this work, Entartete, of course, the reference we know, the Degenerate Art Exhibition of 1937, he's working with the syntax and the language and the appropriation of Jules-Marie Etienne's chronophotographs. I can actually show a very short glimpse of it as well. So in all of these examples, right, if you combine, they're like really kind of video portraits where the focus is on. Yeah, we'll listen to this.
Քաղաքենի նացիոնալիզմին մենք հակադրում ենք պրոլետարական ինտերնացիոնալիզմը, ամբիծ սիրուն մենք դեմ ենք դնում սեռական առողջ բնազդը։ Կռակ, 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 արագ, 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 առակ, առակ։ Տենդոտ, երբ կեղտոտ, տոթի տեղ հոգու, կդնենք մատոր անհողդողտ։ Առաջին պոետն եմ, ռիթմը փոխել եմ ռումբի, ձեր սարկած շոսեն հիմի մի արահետ է, առաջին պոետն եմ, որ հակա պրոպելեր։ Anif.
So yeah, these quotations are from early 20th century avant-garde futurist poets around Tbilisi, Yerevan, and so on. So like he's kind of reviving that legacy, but then also situating it, liberation understood as the liberation of the body desire, almost like in a Wilhelm Reich sense. So yeah, just like a few contextual remarks, and then that's it for today. Thank you.
What time is your train? No, we're good. So now we have the opportunity for some questions. I didn't see you, Dina. Sorry.
No, I'm deliberately hiding because I shouldn't be asking so many questions. This thought might be going into a totally sideways direction, but it was a thought I had when you played the Vremya news snippet. And in relation to the idea of video, you were talking about this idea of the rewind, the pause. And I started thinking about this idea of a kind of personal time, right? Time that does not sit in the standardized structure of if you might sit in the cinema, for example, right? This is what we're talking about, the space of the cinema versus the video. And there was something funny about this, what was it, like 10 seconds of Vremya where, being the post-Soviet empire subject, I also speak Russian, and the news presenters said, it is 6 o'clock Moscow time. And there was something funny that struck me, because I think it was the first time I realized, of course, that strange standardization of time across, 11 time zones that the Soviet Union had, where no matter what republic you were in, somehow your time was always reported to by Moscow time. And so I started thinking about this idea of the kind of personal time versus Moscow time. And of course, you've spoken a lot about video bringing this, let's say, capitalist desire, if not a kind of capitalist reality. But I'm curious as to what dimensions there might have been around video and this notion of independence in Armenia. I hope that question makes sense, or a very rambling, tired thought.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, you're right, there are multiple regimes of time, and I wouldn't say, like that, let's say the Soviet time, the official time, which is Moscow time, right, is more structured than the personal time. Because again, that personal time was articulated, this is, I think, maybe the implicit argument I'm making in relation to like the structure of commodities, the temporalities of capitalist abstraction at the same time. But there is also another temporality, right, that kind of mediates the two, which is, let's say, like the national time. Because you brought up this example of like Moscow time being announced on TV or radio, like I remember while being very young that in the Armenian television or on the Armenian radio, you'd have Moscow time and Yerevan time. По ереванское времени, не знаю как, and so on and so forth. So like both would be announced, and there were also kind of different temporalities, right, of doing and making, from planned economy to responding to the bureaucratic demands, but also within the national context. And I think you gestured towards it in your conversation with Anna. Depending on the position that a particular republic or context had in relation to Moscow, there would be very differential experiences. Like, in Armenia, because it was peripheral, we didn't really have like this kind of strong underground avant-garde. You didn't need to be like really underground. And even if, many of the artists later on, they repackaged their late Soviet practices as kind of resistant and underground, they were even claiming that they are not underground the same way that the Moscow conceptualism would be. Yeah, I hope it kind of answered. But I think there are two different regimes, right? On the one hand, there's kind of the abstraction of commodity time that arrives, not just arrives because it had never been, that is instituted as the main regime in the 90s, but it is also instituted as like really kind of almost like a fiction. What do I mean by this? Because like in the context of like mass unemployment, people weren't going to work, right? So like in this context, in a way, the video would be a tool to pass time as well. So I don't know if I think I need more time to also think through your question and its complexity, but thanks for it.
If no one has a question, I would like to ask a question. I have a question regarding the catalog that you presented, and I was wondering what what the function of this object was for the people having them at home. Were they read as science fiction objects, or because I remember in my childhood I would also see these catalogs and I would never imagine to buy something from them, but still these objects in the catalog would be real for me and accessible in some way. And I was curious what the function it was of having them at home if you could not order anything from them.
I think it was this fascination with new products because, they were like aesthetically beautiful, they were diverse, and it was like, discovering a new world through diversified commodity production as an image, like literally as an image. And we just like sit down and, go through the pages for hours as we were kids. It was like simply this kind of fascination with like the aesthetics of the products themselves. And now, like, actually, I was looking for an image for today's presentation, and I saw that, like, this catalog is on eBay for, like, 70 euros. It's crazy.
One more question from the audience?
Okay.
If not, huh?
I mean, the context has kind of worked itself out in a different way. Like they are not in conversation with each other anymore. Like they're, this ACCA being a kind of a center where everyone gathers is not the case anymore. But like David Karayan, about in 2014, I believe, had an accident and he passed away. Arman Grigoryan died this year actually, earlier. Diana Hakopian has been painting. Tigran just doesn't produce art anymore. He's actually like doing mostly montage for television, for a news outlet. Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you all. I think it's now 5 minutes break again.